The scent of roses lingered in the air that night, heavy and sweet, clinging to the satin tablecloths at the country club. I remember the sound of silverware striking plates and the polite laughter echoing around us, though my mind was caught on something else entirely. Across the table, I watched Tessa lean just a little too close toward my husband, her manicured fingers brushing his sleeve as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mark chuckled that deep laugh I used to love, but there was something different in the way he looked at her, a softness reserved for someone who wasn't me. In that instant, surrounded by people dressed in their best, I felt invisible in my own life, and the truth I had been trying to ignore pressed against my chest like a stone. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of family betrayal and quiet justice. My name is Elena Brooks, and for most of my life, I believed I had built something steady and safe. I grew up in a small Midwestern town, the daughter of 2 school teachers who taught me that love was about loyalty and patience, about building a life where everyone felt seen. By my mid-30s, I thought I had found that with Mark, a man who seemed both ambitious and grounded, someone who could make me laugh in the middle of grocery shopping, and who promised me a future filled with stability. We married, bought a modest but comfortable house in the suburbs, and raised our daughter Lily, who quickly became the light of our lives. From the outside, we looked like any other family built on hard work and quiet devotion. Mark's career in regional sales took off quickly, bringing him into circles I never fully belonged to. Dinners with clients, golf outings with executives, networking events that left me at home grading papers while Lily worked on her homework at the kitchen table. Still, I believed in him, and I believed in us. Every milestone, every birthday, every Christmas morning felt like proof that the sacrifices we made were worth it. When he grew restless, I reminded him of how far we had come. When I grew weary, he reminded me of what we were building. At least, that's how it used to be. Tessa entered our lives years earlier, back when she was just a friendly face helping coordinate a fundraiser for the school. She was striking, always put together with a sharp eye for detail, and she and Mark seemed to hit it off over logistics and planning. I never thought much of it, chalking their easy banter up to personalities that meshed. She became part of our social circle, the kind of friend who brought wine to dinner parties and sent cards on holidays. I trusted her maybe more than I should have, but the night at the country club changed something for me. It wasn't just the way Mark's eyes lingered on her, or the way she touched his arm like she had every right to. It was the realization that I was sitting across from them both, playing the role of supportive wife, while my own husband seemed to forget I was there. The laughter around us felt hollow, the music too loud, and my own smile brittle. I went home with a knot in my chest that I couldn't untangle, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that Mark would never betray me. Still, the unease followed me. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across our kitchen, I watched Mark scroll through his phone with a faint smile tugging at his lips, the kind he usually reserved for Lily's accomplishments or private jokes between us. When I asked what was so funny, he dismissed it with a shake of his head, claiming it was just a work message. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, but the echo of Tessa's laughter from the night before refused to fade, and deep down, I knew something had shifted. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that after 20 years together, I was bound to get insecure from time to time. I told myself he was loyal, that he had proven it for years, and that I was being unfair to doubt him over a fleeting glance and a touch of the hand. Yet the memory haunted me in quiet moments, the softness in his expression, the way she leaned in like she had a claim. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to unsettle the fragile trust I had always carried like a shield. That night at the country club was the first time I saw it. The first time I allowed myself to wonder if I was still the center of Mark's world. And though I tried to silence those doubts, something inside me whispered that this was only the beginning, and the cracks in my perfect life were about to widen. The unease that began at the country club did not fade with time. If anything, it sharpened each time I watched Mark reach for his phone or caught the flicker of a smile that wasn't meant for me. At first, I told myself it was just the residue of that night, the way Tessa's hand had lingered on his sleeve, the way his eyes had softened in response. But as the weeks went on, small details began to string themselves together, forming a picture I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One evening after dinner, I noticed how quickly he excused himself from the table, muttering something about emails from work. Lily was still sitting with me pushing the last of her broccoli around her plate when I heard the faint hum of his voice from the other room. It wasn't the sharp tone he used with colleagues, the clipped precision of business calls. It was warmer, lighter, almost teasing. I strained to catch words, but only managed fragments just enough to twist my stomach into knots. Another time, while folding laundry in our bedroom, I noticed the faint scent of perfume clinging to one of his jackets. It wasn't mine. I wear subtle florals, nothing like the sharp, expensive fragrance that clung to the fabric. I held it up, pressing it to my nose, hoping I was wrong, but the trace was unmistakable. When I asked about it casually, he barely looked up from his laptop, muttering something about a client's wife leaning in too close at a dinner. The explanation sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced it before speaking it aloud. Even our daughter began to notice the difference. Lily asked one night if her dad was traveling more often than usual. She had counted 3 business trips in just 2 months all sudden, all with vague explanations. I smiled and reassured her, saying sometimes work gets busier than expected, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. That doubt mirrored my own, and it broke me to realize I was now trying to shield her from questions I didn't have answers to. The shift between us became more obvious at home. Where once he used to ask about my day, now his responses were curt, distracted, his eyes flicking back to the glow of his phone. He lingered in the garage longer after work, as if he needed time to compose himself before walking through the door. When I pressed, he would sigh, claiming stress deadlines numbers that never added up. I wanted to believe him, but I could feel the space between us widening like a crack in the foundation, silent and dangerous. It wasn't just at home where the change showed. At a neighborhood gathering, I noticed the way Tessa hovered near him, her laughter bubbling a little too loudly at his smallest jokes. When she caught me watching, she offered a quick smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. I sipped my drink, pretending not to see the way her hand brushed his shoulder, as she leaned in to whisper something meant only for him. Every part of me screamed that it wasn't innocent, that something deeper tied them together, but I forced myself to remain composed. The most telling moment came one Saturday afternoon when he said he was running errands. He left the house in casual clothes, no briefcase, no sense of urgency. Hours later, as I drove to pick up groceries, I saw his car parked outside a small cafe across town. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of him sitting across from Tessa, his hand resting on the table dangerously close to hers. They weren't touching, not exactly, but the intimacy between them was clear. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and I drove past without stopping. That image burned itself into me, a truth I could no longer deny. At night, lying beside him, I felt the absence more than the presence. He used to reach for me without thinking, an arm draped over my waist, a hand brushing mine under the covers. Now he turned away, his back a silent wall that no amount of shifting could breach. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, counting the seconds between his breaths, wondering how long he had been giving pieces of himself to someone else, while leaving me scraps of silence. I tried to confront him, once my voice steady, but my heart pounding. I asked if there was something he needed to tell me, If work had truly become so consuming, or if there was another reason for the distance between us. He looked at me with tired eyes, shook his head, and said I was imagining things. The dismissal cut deeper than any confession could have. It told me he wasn't ready to face the truth, and maybe he never would be unless I forced it into the open. The weight of it pressed harder each day. I carried it with me to work, where I smiled at students and listened to parents, while inside I was unraveling. I carried it through dinners, through errands, through quiet evenings with Lily when I tried to be present but felt the ache of betrayal lurking in the corners. The life I had believed was steady and safe was slipping through my fingers, and the man I once trusted with everything was beginning to feel like a stranger in his own home. Still, I held back. I told myself I needed more than suspicion, more than perfume and late nights and whispers over coffee. I needed certainty because once I moved forward, there would be no undoing it. I would not allow myself to be dismissed again, not when the stakes were this high. And so I watched. I waited. I collected the moments, each one heavier than the last, until I could no longer pretend they were fragments of my imagination. The signs were there undeniable, and the crack in my marriage had widened into something I could no longer ignore. What I didn't yet realize was how deep the fracture truly ran, and how close I was to seeing everything come apart. The silence that settled between us was louder than any argument could have been. At night, I lay awake beside Mark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, while my mind played back every fragment I had witnessed. The perfume clinging to his jacket, the cafe, meeting the laughter that seemed to belong to someone else. Now all of it swirled together until I felt I was drowning in proof without ever holding a confession. I wanted to scream to shake him awake and demand the truth, but instead I lay still, afraid of what would spill out if I opened my mouth. During the day, I carried myself as if nothing was wrong. I smiled at students' graded essays and nodded through parent meetings as though my heart wasn't unraveling thread by thread. I hid it well enough that no one at school suspected, but the toll showed in the quiet moments. Driving home, I would grip the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, trying to keep my tears from blurring the road. The weight of it was exhausting, yet I told no one, not even my closest friends, because admitting it aloud would make it real. At home, I felt like a ghost drifting through my own rooms. Mark's phone was always within reach, lighting up with notifications he angled away from me. When I asked simple questions, what time he would be home, whether he wanted me to set aside dinner, his answers came clipped, almost impatient, as if my presence was an interruption. Sometimes I caught him staring at me across the table with an expression I couldn't decipher, equal parts guilt and detachment, before he looked away. Those glances haunted me because they carried both the man I married and the stranger I feared he had become. Lily, sweet as she was, sensed more than I wanted her to. One evening, while we folded laundry together, she looked up and asked quietly if Dad was mad at me. I froze, forcing a smile that didn't feel steady. I told her no, that grown-ups sometimes got busy and distracted, but the worry in her eyes lingered long after the conversation ended. That night, I cried silently in the bathroom, careful to run the faucet so she wouldn't hear. My tears weren't just for myself, but for her, for the cracks she could see even when I tried so hard to hide them. The isolation grew heavier when I realized I had no one I could truly turn to. My own parents lived several states away, and while we spoke often, I couldn't bring myself to confide in them. They admired Mark, believed in the life we had built, and I couldn't bear to shatter that image without certainty. Even with my closest friend, I kept my words vague, pretending my stress was from work rather than home. It was easier to carry the burden alone than to risk being told I was overreacting. Nights became the hardest. I would sit at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, staring at the glow of the overhead light on the polished wood. Sometimes I reached for a glass of wine, hoping it would quiet the storm inside me, but it never did. The house felt cavernous, each room echoing with the distance between us. I thought about the years we had shared, the vacations, the milestones, the laughter, and wondered how it had unraveled so quietly, slipping through my fingers before I realized what was happening. Mark, for his part, acted as though nothing was amiss. He came and went, left notes on the counter about late meetings, and kissed Lily goodnight with the same tenderness he always had. But with me, the small gestures faded. No more hands brushing in the hallway, no more easy laughter over shared jokes, no more warmth in his eyes. I told myself I could endure the silence if it meant preserving the family. But deep down, I knew endurance was not the same as love. The turning point of that season came on a rainy Saturday. I had planned a simple family dinner, roast chicken and vegetables, hoping to draw us back to the table together. Mark arrived late, damp from the storm, muttered a quick excuse, and disappeared into the den with his phone pressed to his ear. I sat at the table with Lily, the plates cooling, my fork untouched. She looked at me with quiet resignation, as if she already knew dinner wouldn't include him. Something in me broke, then a sharp crack inside my chest that no amount of denial could mend. After she went to bed, I confronted him, though my words trembled. I asked if there was something I needed to know, if the distance between us was more than stress. He barely looked up from his phone before muttering that I worried too much, that I should stop imagining things. The dismissal hit me harder than any confession would have. It told me that my pain wasn't worth acknowledging, that my voice had no place in the world he was creating. I retreated to our bedroom and cried silently into the pillow, wondering when I had become so invisible. From that night on, I learned to hold my silence. I smiled when I needed to. I played the role of wife and mother, but inside, I carried a hollow ache that only grew heavier. I kept the suspicion tucked close, gathering each moment like stones in my pocket, weighing me down. I told myself I was waiting, though I didn't yet know for what. Proof, maybe. Courage, perhaps. Or simply the strength to face a truth that terrified me. Each day felt like walking on a fragile bridge, knowing it could collapse beneath me at any moment. I tried to focus on Lily, on work, on anything that kept me from falling too deep into despair. But every glance, every unanswered question, every late night away was another reminder that the life I thought I had built was crumbling. And though I tried to carry it quietly, the silence was becoming unbearable. What I didn't realize then was that the silence would not protect me. It would only sharpen the pain until I could no longer hold it in. And soon, the moment would come when I could not ignore the truth any longer, no matter how much it threatened to break the life I had tried so hard to preserve. The breaking point arrived quietly, without a scene or a fight, just a single message that shifted everything I thought I knew. It was late on a Thursday evening, and I had stayed after school finishing reports when my phone buzzed with a photo from an unfamiliar number. At first, I almost ignored it, assuming it was a wrong send, but when I opened it, my breath caught. There was Mark sitting in a booth at a downtown restaurant, his head bent close to Tessa's, their hands nearly touching across the table. The caption was simple, "Thought you should know." For a long moment, I sat frozen in my office chair, staring at the screen, as if it could somehow change if I blinked hard enough. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in the hum of the fluorescent light louder than my own heartbeat. I wanted to believe it was a trick, some misunderstanding, but the truth was undeniable. The jacket he wore was the same one hanging in our closet, and the smile on his face was one I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred through the windshield, and I realized I was no longer holding suspicions, I was holding proof. The weight of it settled differently, not as a burden, but as clarity. I knew then that my silence had protected no one, least of all myself. I had been shrinking to keep peace, but all it had done was give him space to build a life that excluded me. Something inside me hardened, not with rage, but with resolve. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I watched more carefully. I noticed the way he lingered too long in the shower. After returning from work dinners, the faint shimmer of lip gloss on his shirt collar that wasn't mine, the eagerness with which he answered texts that made his phone light up late at night. I didn't ask questions anymore, and that unnerved him more than my suspicions had. He would study me across the dinner table, waiting for me to speak, but I just nodded and smiled, keeping my thoughts to myself. The following weekend, I told him I needed to run errands and slipped away with a different purpose. I drove to the restaurant where the photo had been taken, the small place tucked on a quiet street near the river. I asked the hostess casually if she had seen Mark there recently, describing him and Tessa without naming them. Her expression shifted quickly, recognition flickering before she masked it. "They come in often," she said, then hesitated. "They always ask for the corner booth." I thanked her and left my suspicions now stitched together with certainty. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table, the same place I had once planned meals and holidays, and pulled out a notebook. For the first time in months, I didn't cry. I wrote dates, details, observations, each one clear as day, now that I wasn't trying to explain them away. It wasn't about catching him anymore. It was about preparing myself step by quiet step for what came next. That night when he came home, I studied him in a way that felt new. He greeted me with a tired kiss on the cheek, asked if Lily had finished her homework, and walked upstairs to change. Everything about the moment was ordinary, but I saw it differently. I noticed how carefully he avoided my eyes, how quickly he moved past me, how shallow his smile had become. I realized then that the man I had built a life with was no longer mine, and maybe hadn't been for some time. The days that followed brought a strange calm. I still cooked dinner, still asked about his schedule, still played the part he expected me to play. But inside, I was gathering strength. The pain had been sharp before cutting into me with every suspicion, every dismissal, every unanswered question. Now it dulled into something steadier, like a scar forming where the wound once was. I wasn't waiting for him to confess anymore. I was preparing for the moment when I would no longer need his answers. One evening, as I cleared the table, he reached for my hand, perhaps out of habit. I pulled back gently, pretending not to notice, and the flicker of confusion on his face told me he felt the shift. He asked if I was all right, and I smiled, telling him I was tired from work. The truth was, I had never seen more clearly. For months, I had been begging silently for scraps of honesty, but now I was ready to stop begging altogether. The awakening wasn't loud or dramatic. It came in the quiet realization that I could survive without his love, but I could not survive without my own dignity. Every moment of silence, every tear shed in secret had been leading me to this point. I was no longer clinging to what we had been. I was bracing myself for what I needed to do. And as I folded the last dish towel that night, I knew the time was coming soon when I would no longer be the woman holding her pain in silence. I would be the one deciding what came next, and for the first time in months, I felt ready to face whatever truth waited on the other side. The first quiet step I took wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a Saturday morning when Mark left for errands and Lily was out with friends. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once written lesson plans and grocery lists, and opened my laptop. My hands trembled only slightly as I began creating a folder, labeling it with nothing more than a single letter. Inside, I saved the photo I had received, the notes I had written about his late nights, the receipts I had pulled from his pockets when he wasn't looking. It was a simple act, but it felt like reclaiming something he had stolen, my right to truth. Once I began, it became easier. I paid closer attention to the small details, things I had brushed aside before. I checked our joint bank account more carefully and saw dinners charged in neighborhoods far from his usual client meetings. I noticed cash withdrawals that didn't match his explanations. Each piece was small on its own, but together they formed a picture I couldn't deny. I didn't confront him with any of it. Instead, I kept collecting, storing, arranging. If he wanted to live in shadows, then I would be the one to turn on the light when the time came. The next step was speaking to someone I trusted outside the family. At school, I had a colleague named Karen Mitchell, a woman a few years older than me, who had once been through a divorce of her own. She wasn't a close friend, but she carried herself with quiet strength, and I sensed she would understand. One afternoon, after the last bell had rung, I asked if she had a moment. We sat in her classroom, the scent of chalk dust still in the air, and I told her not everything, but enough. Her expression never wavered as she listened, and when I finished, she placed her hand over mine and said softly, "You're not crazy, Elena. Trust what you're seeing." Her words steadied me more than she knew. That night, I lay awake beside Mark, his back turned to me as always, and thought about the difference between surviving and living. For months, I had been surviving, smiling through tears, cooking meals no one appreciated, bearing my pain so Lily wouldn't see it. But living meant reclaiming my own dignity piece by piece. I decided then that I would not be his silent partner in deceit. I would prepare carefully, quietly, until the day came when his lies could no longer stand. Over the next few weeks, I adjusted how I moved around him. I asked fewer questions about his schedule, no longer giving him the chance to lie directly to my face. I smiled when necessary, answered when spoken to, but I stopped offering pieces of myself freely. He noticed, though he pretended not to. One evening, he asked if something was wrong, and I simply said I was tired. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he knew I was slipping from his grasp, but couldn't place how. That small flicker of unease in him gave me strength. I also began protecting myself in practical ways. I opened a separate bank account, something small at first, tucked away quietly so he wouldn't notice. I transferred bits of money from tutoring sessions and side work amounts too small to raise suspicion. I told myself it was for emergencies, but deep down, I knew it was for the day when I would need to stand on my own. For years, I had trusted him with our financial future, but trust no longer lived here. It wasn't only money I gathered. I went through our files at home, pulling copies of tax returns, insurance policies, and property documents. Each time I slipped a paper into my bag, my heart pounded, but he never noticed. He was too busy on his phone, too distracted by the world he thought he had hidden. With every document I secured, I felt steadier, like I was building a foundation beneath myself that no amount of betrayal could shake again. Through it all, I carried the weight in silence, careful not to let Lily see the cracks. But children notice more than we give them credit for. One evening, as we washed dishes together, she looked at me with quiet eyes and asked, "Are you okay, Mom?" I forced a smile and said yes, but she didn't look convinced. I kissed the top of her head and told her she was my reason for everything. And she was. Every quiet step I took was not just for me, but for her, for the example I would set about dignity, strength, and the refusal to be erased. The hardest part was waiting. Each night he came home later, his excuses thinner, and I wanted so badly to throw the evidence in his face, but I held back. I reminded myself that rushing would only give him control, and I had already surrendered enough. Instead, I waited for the cracks in his facade to grow wider, for his lies to trip over each other, for the moment when the truth could no longer be contained. One Friday evening, as he claimed another late meeting, I drove past the office where he said he would be. The parking lot was nearly empty, only a handful of cars left under the flickering lights, but not his. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the proof sharper than any photo could provide. When I drove home, I didn't cry. I simply added another line to the growing record in my notebook. The truth was not a storm anymore. It was a tide steady and unstoppable. By then, I no longer felt like the woman who had sat at the kitchen table in tears, begging herself to believe in scraps of love. I felt different, steadier, as though each quiet step had rebuilt me from the inside out. He didn't see it not yet, but the balance between us was shifting. For months, I had been the one left in the dark. Now I was the one holding the lantern, waiting for the right moment to let the light pour out. And deep down, I knew that moment was coming soon. The patience I had gathered, the silence I had carried, the evidence I had collected, they were no longer weights dragging me down. They were tools, and when the time came, I would use them not with fury, but with precision. The breaking point arrived on a gray evening in early spring, when the air carried the damp chill of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Mark had told me he was working late, another meeting that would keep him out until after 9. I nodded as he said it, my face calm, my voice steady, but my hands were already tightening around the truth I had been holding for weeks. That night, I didn't stay home. I drove downtown, parking a block away from a restaurant I knew too well by now. Through the glass, I saw them before I even stepped onto the sidewalk. Mark sat in the corner booth with Tessa, his jacket draped across the seat beside him, his face lit with a softness I hadn't seen in years. Their heads leaned close together, their laughter spilling into the dim light like a private melody. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, not with shock anymore, but with a clarity so sharp it steadied me. This wasn't suspicion or proof hidden in files, it was reality playing out in front of me. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo through the glass, and walked back to my car with my hands as still as stone. I drove home slowly, the city lights blurring through the windshield, and when I pulled into our driveway, I felt a quiet resolve settle in. I wasn't going to keep watching from the sidelines. It was time for them to face what they had been so sure they could hide. When Mark came home later, he hung his jacket in the hallway and walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie as he went. He kissed my cheek lightly, like a man performing a duty, and poured himself a glass of water. I let the silence stretch before I spoke. "How was dinner?" I asked softly, my eyes never leaving his. He froze his glass halfway to his lips before forcing a smile. "I told you meetings ran long." I pulled my phone from my pocket and slid it across the table. The photo glowed on the screen between us. His face drained of color. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Elena, it's not what you think." His words sounded tired, rehearsed a script he had prepared for this moment. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Then tell me, Mark. What exactly is it?" He faltered, his hands tightening around the edge of the table, his gaze dropping to the floor. For the first time in months, I felt taller than him, stronger than the excuses he tried to piece together. Before he could stumble through another lie, I placed a folder on the table, the same one I had been building quietly for weeks. Inside were receipts, notes, documents, every piece I had collected. His eyes widened as he flipped through them, the silence between us thickening with every page. He looked up, finally, his voice breaking. "You've been keeping track." I met his gaze evenly. "I've been preparing." "You handed me nothing but silence, Mark. I learned to fill it myself." The weight of my words left him speechless. For once, He couldn't twist the story, couldn't bend me back into submission. He reached for my hand across the table, but I pulled back steady and sure. You wanted a life with her, or maybe with anyone who wasn't me. But you don't get to erase me quietly. Not anymore. His mouth opened then closed again, the sound of his breath shallow in the stillness of the kitchen. The confrontation didn't end with a shout or a slammed door. It ended with silence, the kind that settles after a storm has broken. He left the table, retreating upstairs, while I remained where I was, my hands resting on the folder. I should have felt shattered, but instead, I felt steady, like the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting. The truth was no longer hidden. It was laid bare between us, undeniable. The next day, whispers began to ripple through our circle of friends. It didn't take long, these things never do. I hadn't said a word, but Tessa must have, or perhaps Mark, desperate to spin his version first. At the grocery store, I caught the lingering glances, the way neighbors lowered their voices as I passed. Rowena Grant, Tessa's sister-in-law, cornered me in the produce aisle, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I heard things have been difficult, she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. I simply looked at her, my expression calm before walking away. Their whispers no longer had power over me. That weekend, Mark tried again. He came into the living room where I was folding laundry, his face worn, his eyes tired. "We can fix this," he said quietly, almost pleading. I set down the shirt in my hands and looked at him. "Fix what, Mark? The marriage you left the moment you let her take my place? Or the family you risked for something you couldn't even name out loud?" His shoulders sagged, his lips parting with no words to follow. He turned away, and I knew then that whatever fight he had left wasn't for me. It was for appearances, for control, for everything but love. In the days that followed, the distance between us grew into a canyon. He left earlier, came home later, his presence in the house, a shadow of what it once had been. But I no longer filled the silence with tears. I filled it with plans, with quiet strength, with the certainty that his betrayal would not define me. The confrontation had shifted the balance. He had been exposed, and now it was only a matter of time before the life he had built on lies began to collapse. And as I watched him retreat further into the world he had chosen, I knew my part in this story was far from over. The breaking point had come and gone, and now the weight of his choices would begin to show. Soon, justice would no longer be an idea I held in secret. It would be the reality he would have no choice but to face. Justice did not come in a single moment, but unfolded piece by piece, each step stripping away the image Mark and Tessa had tried so hard to maintain. After the confrontation, I chose silence, letting them wonder what I might do next. It didn't take long for their own choices to catch up with them. The first blow came at Mark's office. A colleague of his, a woman named Denise Harper, called me one afternoon. We had spoken only briefly at company events, but she sounded uneasy on the phone. She said whispers had begun circulating. Clients noticed Mark's late nights with Tessa, who was not only my supposed friend, but also the event planner contracted by his firm. The impropriety was impossible to ignore once vendors started complaining about unpaid invoices connected to Tessa's side business. Denise spoke carefully, but her message was clear. His reputation was unraveling, and it wasn't me fueling the fire. It was their carelessness. At home, his frustration turned into sharp words and long silences. I stayed calm, carrying myself through each day, with a steadiness that seemed to unnerve him more than anger ever could. The folder I had prepared remained in the desk drawer, untouched but powerful, a reminder that I was not defenseless. He knew it was there, and that knowledge sat between us like a wall he couldn't climb. Then came the neighborhood fundraiser. It was an annual event at the community hall, one Tessa had helped organize for years. I arrived quietly with Lily determined to keep my dignity intact. As we mingled among the tables, I saw the way conversations hushed when Tessa entered with Mark at her side. For the first time, she didn't carry herself with that same effortless confidence. Her smile was too tight, her laugh brittle. People who once greeted her warmly now offered cool nods, their eyes darting back to me. I hadn't said a word to anyone, but truth has a way of slipping through cracks. By the end of the night, she and Mark left early, their heads low, while I remained with Lily speaking easily with neighbors who seemed relieved to know where their sympathies lay. The true collapse came weeks later when Mark's father, Walter, invited me over. He had always been a reserved man, but he looked weary as he poured coffee at the kitchen table. He told me he had heard enough to know his son had destroyed something valuable, and though he couldn't undo it, he wanted me to know I had his respect. I listened quietly, grateful for the kindness, even if it came too late to change anything. His words traveled quickly, though. By the following weekend, half the family knew Mark's betrayal wasn't rumor, it was fact. Mark, cornered on every side, tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. One evening, he stood in the doorway as I folded laundry, his voice sharp as he accused me of humiliating him. I looked at him steadily, then said, "You did that yourself, Mark. I just stopped covering for you." His face flushed, his mouth opening with no words to follow. He stormed out, slamming the door, but the sound only confirmed what I already knew: his power over me was gone. Meanwhile, Tessa's business began to crumble. Vendors she relied on pulled contracts, unwilling to be tied to her name after seeing her entanglement with Mark. Brides whispered about her unreliability, stories circulating about unpaid deposits and favoritism. One afternoon, I overheard two mothers at the school gates talking in low voices about how they would never hire her again. Her carefully polished image had cracked, and once the cracks appeared, the whole structure collapsed. For me, the justice wasn't in watching them suffer. It was in the stillness of knowing I no longer carried the shame. It had shifted back to them exactly where it belonged. I carried myself through each day with a calm that grew lighter, while Mark moved through the house like a shadow, the weight of his choices pressing down. He still tried to reach for control at times, but it always slipped through his hands. The final confirmation came one evening when Lily sat with me at the kitchen table. She asked if things would ever be the same, her voice quiet but steady. I took her hand and told her gently, "No, sweetheart, but different doesn't mean worse. Sometimes truth has to break things so we can build something better." She nodded slowly, her eyes full of understanding beyond her years. And in that moment, I knew the real victory wasn't over. Mark or Tessa, it was in protecting her from believing that betrayal had to be accepted. By then, Mark's life was unraveling publicly. Clients pulled back, colleagues distanced themselves, and his name carried the weight of disappointment. Tessa avoided gatherings altogether, her absence as telling as any confession. The two of them had tried to build their world on secrecy and lies, but lies cannot hold the weight of scrutiny. They collapsed under it, leaving me standing quietly intact, with the dignity they had tried to take from me. And though their downfall was not loud or violent, it was thorough. Piece by piece, their control slipped away, until the only thing left between us was the certainty that I had survived what they could not. What remained now was not vengeance, but reflection. The storm had passed, and I was left standing in the quiet aftermath, ready to decide what my life would look like beyond the ruins they had left behind. In the weeks that followed, the noise around Mark and Tessa grew quiet, not because the damage had been repaired, but because there was nothing left to defend. Their names, once so carefully polished, had become heavy with whispers of betrayal. Invitations stopped arriving. Neighbors no longer lingered on their porch, and clients who once sought mark out moved on to steadier hands. I watched all of it from a distance, not with glee, but with the calm certainty that justice has a way of taking care of itself. At home, the silence changed. It was no longer filled with my hidden tears or his empty excuses. It was just silent, still, and heavy, the sound of two people standing on opposite sides of something broken. Eventually, even that faded as he moved his things from our house into a small apartment closer to the office. Lily and I adjusted together, building new rhythms that didn't depend on his presence. Dinner at the table became ours again, filled with her laughter and the small details of her days. Walter visited often, bringing Lily her favorite milkshakes and sitting with me in the living room. He never excused his son, but he offered his quiet support, reminding me that sometimes strength isn't in what you fight, but in what you refuse to carry. Karen, my colleague, continued to check in her steady presence, a reminder that I wasn't alone, even when the road felt uncertain. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to feel whole again. There were nights when I still asked myself how I had missed the signs, how love had turned into something so brittle without me seeing. But then I remembered that trust is not weakness. It is the foundation every marriage is built upon. I had given my trust freely, and it was he who squandered it. What remained was not shame, but proof that my love had been real, even if his had not endured. As for Tessa, she slipped quietly out of the picture. Her business withered, her name no longer a reliable one in the circles she once dominated. People spoke of her only in passing, with the caution reserved for those who build themselves on borrowed loyalty. She had wanted a place in my life, but in the end, she carved herself out of it completely. Through it all, Lily grew into her own strength. She saw me stand firm when it would have been easier to collapse, and though I wished she had been spared the pain, I knew the lesson was important. She learned that betrayal, no matter how deep, does not define us. What defines us is how we rise after it. Looking back now, I don't see myself as the woman abandoned at her own kitchen table, clutching at scraps of honesty. I see myself as the woman who found her voice again, who refused to be erased by silence or lies. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had been mine all along. And that is the lesson I carry with me, the one I hope stays with anyone who has walked through something similar. Betrayal may take what we thought was certain, but it cannot touch our worth unless we hand it over. Strength sometimes comes quietly, in the steady way we choose not to break, in the way we build again, even after the storm has passed. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.